Kevin, for the introduction. I would like to welcome the panelist for this session, which is Mr. Tamer Al-Gamali. He's the CISO for National Bank of Kuwait. He's currently responsible of the Information Security Management System and Information Security Program at NBAK, and he's the co-founder and president of the first Isaac Square chapter in GCC. Our next speaker is Abdirashid Samater. He's the Information Security Advisor at the Ministry of Justice in Saudi Arabia. He's currently the member of ISACA and DRI Canada. He also holds a Master's in Science from the University of Liverpool in UK. Finally, I would like to introduce Dr. Badr Al-Manthari. He's executive in Information Security Department at Information Technology Authority Oman. He holds a patent in 3.5G and WiMAX, and another patent is being prepared for the 4G technologies. So just to start up the session, cloud computing as a concept and as a terminology and as a service in the industry, and especially in the information security industry, it's always being highlighted as a high risk and underlined with lots of red lines. But whether you like it or not, you'll have one of your business executives just a mile away from going for a cloud service. It's just a matter of having a Visa card or a MasterCard, and he will just easily go on any of the cloud kind of services and just purchase that or subscribe, and you will have all the data over the net. So basically, we cannot stop cloud. We need to manage the risk for that. So the first one who's going to start the session is Mr. Tamer. So I will hand over the mic to Tamer.
Right, good afternoon. As usual, a bit light on people. So I'm just going to set the tone and cover some of the stuff to do with cloud computing. I'm not an expert on cloud. It's not my specialized subject. However, I've got a view on it. So it's not going away. Cloud computing is going to be around, and I think it's growing at a fairly phenomenal rate. They expect it to triple over the next 5 years. In terms of what's driving it, from my own personal experience, we're seeing something which is referred to now as shadow IT. You know, you're seeing, firstly, the IT department themselves looking for cheaper ways to do things, centralizing and utilizing common infrastructure to save money. And you're now seeing, you know, the business people, the regular employees within organizations effectively utilizing cloud, probably without the IT department knowing, or probably without them actually knowing it themselves. If I mention some of these terms, Dropbox, Google Drive, YouSendIt, Evernote, they're all cloud-based applications that people are using on their iPads or on their phones. And they're using them to share information, could be work information, presentations, spreadsheets, etc. So there is an element now of what we call, you know, non-IT based services that staff are using to do work. And just recently on Saturday, I don't know if anyone here uses Evernote, probably not a good idea to put your hand up, compromised on Saturday, 50 million user accounts had to be reset. So they pretty much informed their entire user base, go and reset your password. So only God knows what data is stored in their cloud. I mean, they're holding corporate information, presentations from all their users. So talking about virtual borders, one of the key functions of the cloud, or one of the attributes, is that you don't actually know where your data is being stored. So you can request services from a company, and they don't normally have to disclose to you where that data is going to be stored. So that remains a challenge for companies that need a little bit more clarity on where that data is going to reside. In terms of, one of the issues I see is in terms of regulation and the law around cloud computing is not quite defined yet, and it won't support true global cloud. I think if you look at the countries that are leading this, you've got the US, you've got Canada, you've got Europe to a certain extent. I mean, the Data Privacy Act in the UK was established in 1998, and then now the European Union have now got a general regulation that should go live in 2014 to help govern and control liabilities and responsibilities around data loss, because ultimately, before you put data in the cloud, you need to understand who's responsible for that data, where it's going to be stored. And currently, one of the problems is the penalties around incidents are not high enough. One of the last incidents that I read was you know, a few 100,000 records were lost and the company was only fined £350,000. So one of the recommendations in the new law would be to fine the companies based on a percentage of their turnover. So a company that, you know, could be fined up to 2% of their annual turnover rather than a fixed amount. So I think we're waiting for a little bit more maturity around the law, data privacy laws and the regulation around the actual governance of the data. In terms of this region, I don't think there's any country in the GCC that has an implemented cyber law. Most of them that covers data privacy, most of them have guidelines and standards, but nothing's implemented yet. Saudi, to a certain extent, have implemented some rules to do with the data ownership. So no electronic banking data relating to a Saudi national can be stored outside of Saudi. You know, rules similar to that. In terms of the challenges, you know, bring your own device. Everyone's talking about BYOD, which is one of the main ways people are connecting to cloud now. So they're bringing their own device. They're bringing their own applications. These are not applications that you would normally manage yourself. They're bringing their own data to a certain extent into your environment. They're probably taking data out of your environment onto the phones. So this is definitely a challenge, and I think it's something which isn't going to go away. We've got to try and find ways to use this in a secure manner. And the device itself is now becoming critical in terms of security for not just for organizations, but for the cloud. So there's a company at the back there, I'm not going to mention their names, who are provide security for the device authentication, even things like disk encryption at the hardware level. So increasing the factors of authentication for cloud access and for corporate access is something which is going to be developed. In terms of the use of cloud, I think that secure transmission paths is another element that was on my points to discuss. So here I think they're just covering, you know, how you're going to access the clouds. Are you going to use VPNs? Is it going to be over an encrypted channel for communication? Then secondly, you've got, you know, if there's technology available to encrypt data that's stored in the cloud, do you actually care where that's being stored? So if I'm using a cloud and I know as soon as it sits on their infrastructure, it's encrypted, the concern around the location doesn't drop slightly. I think the number of devices is booming. People are now carrying, I mean, I know I've got a couple of iPhones and iPad, and they're all connected to the work environment. So I think in terms of bringing in technology policies for using that, I think that's important. Back to people, staff themselves in your organization are a threat that gets targeted. They themselves are also the threat. So, you know, from a cyber threat perspective, I might target staff within your organization to obtain information in order to do something. Equally, them downloading apps onto their iPhone and connecting it to the cloud and possibly ticking a few buttons that say share my contacts, share my calendars, they themselves could become a liability as well. So I think that certainly cloud computing is a very, very powerful service or infrastructure or technology which is available for everyone to use. It can almost be described as limitless in terms of capacity and storage. But before we actually try and use it, we need to understand how we can use it from an organization. Where would it apply? Can we use it? What type of services could we use it for? I think there's still further development required from the data governance and data ownership perspective in order to make it safe and comfortable for, you know, for sensitive matters to be used. And I think that pretty much concludes what I would have given as a quick introduction to cloud computing. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamer. All right, thank you, Tamer, for the briefing. We'll have Abdirashid delivering a presentation for the next 10 minutes. Please, Mr. Abdirashid.
Bismillah, wassalatu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. And today my presentation is about cloud and mobile security. And this is the agenda. If I can get 4 words across to you, that will be enough today. The first 2 is about security implementer. Normally, when you go to implement security, you need to look for 2 things. feasibility and control. Do I have feasibility what's happening on my network, at the network level, application level, and how do I control? The second thing is about auditor. It is trust but verify. Security solution has been implemented. Yes, you have trust, it's working fine, but as auditor, you need to verify. By following these 4 things, I'm sure you can enhance the security of your organization. Cloud is like everything else. Every new technology needs time to stabilize. What makes cloud security an issue? Because cloud changes the way we used to do things before. It adds one more layer. Before, when you have a piece of hardware, your OS and application, they have direct communication to your hardware. But having a hypervisor or virtualization layer creates an abstraction. And it makes different critical systems to share the same hardware. And the word sharing is where the issue is. Imagine you have several customers putting their server on a public cloud. Then you have to consider who's your neighbor. Is there any isolation? And also this makes more difficult about security device we used to use before. We used to use physical appliances at the network level. With the cloud, virtual server communication to another virtual server cannot be seen by the network level device. This creates another security risk. When you go to a cloud, you need also to implement virtual security solutions. So this is the issue. The second thing is, when you introduce a new solution, you have to address the security part of it. The hypervisor itself creates a security hole unless you follow the best practices that given by the vendor. But most of the time, people install a hypervisor and they move on installing the OS and application, and they worry about patching the OS and the application, and they forget the critical part, which is the hypervisor. If your hypervisor is compromised, then the person gains access all servers running on top of the hypervisor. The second issue about cloud is multi-tenancy, because when you share your critical data on the cloud, you are utilizing cloud. You have to make sure this cloud service provider is providing isolation, is providing data segregation. You need to know where's your data location. If it's outside your country, you need to understand what are the implications. You need to understand data backup, how it's going to back up, who's going to recover. And most important thing is privileged user access. Who's going to manage your users? But if you're building your own private cloud, again, still you have to see your critical servers. You need to organize in a way that they are not compromised by having just a VDI, virtual machine, on the same hypervisor. So it's very important, these two things, multi-tenancy issues and hypervisor issues. When it comes to security and monitoring, if you're going to outsource your data and put in the service provider, you need to see where they stand when it comes to security and monitoring. How they're doing. Are they still staying only in the compliance stage, or they're into proactive and predictive? I have seen so many companies, they spend a lot of time getting compliance. Compliance, yes, it's good, but it doesn't mean you are secure, because compliance gives you a certain area to address. You don't settle to be only a compliance, but you should go to be proactive and predictive. You need to have the right solutions that give you analysis on your network. It gives you proactive. I have seen some companies, they are certified and they get their security policy. It's on the shelf. If you ask, for example, how do we enforce this policy? They don't have automated tools to use. One example being, they said they have a domain admin, administrator on the domain, and they have 4 or 5 seniors. They said, please don't log in using administrator, use your own account. How do you know if one of the employees is using a administrative account? You must be living document. You have the solution. If somebody logs in as administrator, you need to get an alert. And this alert, you have to ask, where's the request for you? What requirement to let you log in administrator? So you don't only rely on policy, but you need to look a way to enforce your policy automatically. The other thing is, you don't only settle with security and monitoring. You need to have a solution where you are running a vulnerability assessment on the environment to discover how much you open outside the world before hackers get to know it and patch it and fix it. The second thing, security is all about data. And when you're going to put your data on the cloud, you must make sure you are encrypting the critical data. One of the first things overlooked is data classification. My question is, does your organization has data classification? Is it data classified as medium, low, and high? Is there any enforcement making sure that a critical data is treated a certain way? Most of the people, they skip the data classification issue, but it's very important because all we are talking is how to secure the data. So you need to make sure if you're going to use a public cloud, your data is encrypted, and they're using a strong encryption, and the key management, you are managing the keys. Second thing, you have to make sure, how do they back up your data? How many copies your data exists? You must have feasibility about your data. Is it encrypted? How many backup are there? How many copies exist? You have to follow where they are. And also the cloud service provider should give you tools to monitor what's been agreed. You have a feasibility to see your data backup. You have feasibility to see how many copies you have, who is accessing, and from where. The other thing is mobile. Normally, the handshake is not the problem. The problem is identity. A mobile user going to connect to your network, how do you identify? And if you are hosting your data on a cloud service provider, then you need to make sure how the identity provisioning and deprovisioning is handled. It's very important. The second thing, are they using strong authentication, like two-factor or three-factor authentication? What about the authorization? All these things need to be agreed clearly. And also, you see how many compliance they have in terms of certification, and do they have ways of making sure the customers are meeting these compliance issues? Finally, is the mobile security. How many of you using a mobile device to access corporate information? Can you raise please your hand? How many of you using a mobile device? I think most of us are using. Did you sign any security policy stating what you should do and what not on your mobile? Some of us, they have administrative privilege. They are a member of privileged users, and they are using Android. This is not secure because the endpoint, the underlying OS, OSI, is not very clear in terms of security. Still, it's at early stages. Also, some of the mobiles can be jailbroken. They can go up source and download any type of software. So to make sure your mobile is secure, you need to go through this. Number one, you should clearly lay out mobile security policy, and you should share your end users, because you need to enable them to use their mobile. At the same time, they have to know they are accessing critical information. So it must be balanced. They have to buy in the security policy. Second thing, you need to do risk analysis to understand, I'm going to do a mobile deployment. What are the risks on my network or my critical systems? Then put this risk assessment, and then based on that, develop mobile device management, or MDM. This allows you the ability to enforce your policy. For example, you said, we don't allow jailbroken mobile to connect. If you have this solution, at the time of gaining access, it will check if this mobile is jailbroken, and then it will not allow access. You say you are non-compliant. If you're asking, for example, the mobile to be encrypted, Before they gain access, this solution can check if this mobile is encrypted enabled or not. If not enabled, they will not gain access. They will be non-compliant. Another example is a remote wipe, for example. You have to sign from the user acceptance. If you bring a mobile, for example, we may wipe all the mobile or we wipe the corporate data. So you must have a solution to wipe a mobile device if it's been lost. Also, you need to make sure access control. For example, you have the ability to provision and deprovision application to the mobile on the fly. You don't let the user to choose and do the setting. And finally, you must have a solution that detects a malware, whether it's a mobile or desktop. At the network level, you should be able to have a visibility what's happening on your network and understand this is a callback, and you have to control and prevent it. So really, mobile and cloud is a new technology, but if you use a best practice, it can add a good value to a network. But if the security part is ignored, it can bring the organization down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdirashid, for the presentation. Dr. Badr is going to discuss the last viewpoint, which is about the centralized data solutions for cloud technology and legal frameworks and implications. So please, Dr. Badr.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you had a good lunch today. So I'm intending to go to discuss very briefly about the legal implication of using cloud computing and maybe touch a little bit about some of the future or some of the current research trends. And if I have time, I will go over some of the recommendations. Like any other technology, cloud computing has a number of issues that we really need to think about before deciding to use its services, among which is the legal and compliance issues. For example, when talking about cloud computing, the issue of location transparency becomes extremely important. With cloud computing, data may be stored and even processed in different geographical locations that may come under different jurisdictions, each with its own set of laws that govern data privacy and security. In fact, in many jurisdictions, the government have the power and the authority to access any data residing within their limits. And of course, they can seize data in case of investigations or incidents. There are also concerns about unauthorized access to seize data not related to the warrant in case of investigations. For example, if the whole physical hardware is seized as a result of an investigation, then your data, which may not be related to the warrant and which happens to be residing on the same physical hardware that was seized, there are no guarantees that your data will not be accessed. There are no laws that protect you or protect your data from being accessed in other jurisdictions. So the question here is incident handling or investigations done properly and according to your own requirements and the set of laws and regulations that you have to comply with. Of course, in some countries, there are certain laws that mandate certain critical financial and defense-related data not to leave the premises of the country for information or for security-related reasons. Another important question that you should ask yourself is the cloud service provider that you select compliant with the rules and regulations that you have to comply with? So various forms of regulations exist. For example, in the US, there's the SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, there is the Basel, and there's also the HIPAA, the Health Information Privacy. In the credit card industry, there's the PCI. There are many privacy laws in the US and the UK and in Europe that you have to comply with. And another also important question is, how do you maintain your service level agreements with your customers? You have many commitments that are defined in the SLAs. So if you choose to use a cloud service provider, then you are outsourcing some of your services and functions to a third party, which is the cloud service provider, which may in turn outsource also some of its functions and services to a fourth party that you don't even know about. So the question here is that how could you maintain your SLAs with your customers if the cloud service provider that you choose or you select cannot maintain such SLAs, especially when it comes to the quality of service and availability and so on. So I will talk about this maybe in the recommendations if I have some time, but you really have to read and understand the SLA with the service cloud provider and try to impose your own requirements as much as possible in order to address all of those issues. I will talk a little bit about the current research trends in cloud computing, particularly in the area of information of cloud security. Of course, cloud computing is a very hot research area. There's a lot of work in many different aspects, including security. For example, there is currently an ongoing work on developing multi-clouds or inter-clouds, which sometimes is called also clouds or off clouds, in order to solve the availability issue, the malicious insider issue, and the confidentiality issue of cloud computing. So what is a multi-cloud? A multi-cloud is an environment that controls several clouds to avoid dependency on an individual cloud. The main reason for using a multi-cloud environment is to distribute reliability, trust, and security among different cloud providers. For example, imagine that your data is distributed among different cloud providers. Then, if one of them goes out of business, or their services go out as a result of attack or insider attack, then you can still utilize the services of other cloud providers. Or if your data is lost or leaked as a result of an insider or malicious insider attack, then you can still use, or the rest of your data will still be kept safe in other cloud providers. Of course, under this concept, there's a lot of work for communication protocols and for, of course, the open APIs that will allow you to interact with different cloud providers and will allow different cloud providers to interoperate with each other. There is also, I talked about the location issue. You don't know where your data is located and under which jurisdiction. And so to address this issue, there is currently also some work on developing location-aware protocols. These protocols will allow you to query, and also you may be able to restrict where your data resides. So currently, with current cloud providers, you don't know where your data resides and you have no jurisdiction over it. But with these protocols, hopefully you'll be able to query where your data is, and you may also be able to restrict where your data resides. There is, of course, also a lot of work on standardization and open APIs to solve the interoperability problem of cloud computing. And also, one of the main issues of cloud computing that was also mentioned repeatedly today is the confidentiality issue. So how to keep your data safe, how to keep your data confidential, especially the sensitive data. I talked about multi-clouds, which is an ongoing research effort. But one of the simplest ways to keep your data safe is to encrypt the data. Of course, encrypting the data can ensure confidentiality, and it's very effective in data aggregation and storage. But encrypting the data will make it very difficult to process. And you always have to decrypt the data in order to process it. You cannot work with encrypted data using traditional encryption algorithms. And so to solve it or to address this issue, there is currently some work to enable some kind of processing on ciphertext data, such as, for example, the homomorphic encryption, which will allow to perform some basic processing on the encrypted data without the need to decrypt it. So, for example, if you have, for example, currently 2 encrypted numbers, and you want to sum them up, you will get a garbage. You have first to decrypt those 2 numbers in order to, and then sum them up, and then encrypt the result again. With the homomorphic encryption, you can perform some basic arithmetic on the encrypted data and get an encrypted result without even knowing what the result is, unless you decrypt the data. So you can take 2 numbers, encrypted numbers, sum them up, and then you will get an encrypted result. So we can do some basic processing on the encrypted data, and these are very advanced ideas. There is also some work on developing some encryption algorithms that will allow you to do some basic search on the encrypted data. Again, with the encrypted data currently and using traditional encryption algorithms, you cannot do any kind of search. You have to decrypt the data first. But with these new kinds of encryption algorithms, they will allow you to perform some basic search on the encrypted data without the need to decrypt it. I have only 1 minute, so I think I will just conclude by maybe I can talk about the recommendations later, but I really want to emphasize that for organizations to move their data to the cloud, it is, I mean, they really have to adopt a risk-based approach to move their data to the cloud, because nothing can ensure 100% security. So a risk-based approach is very important for the organizations before considering to move to the cloud. Organizations really have to understand and they have to evaluate and define their security requirements and security tolerance. The security requirements and the security tolerance, or the appetite, or the risk tolerance, sorry, are different from one organization to another. So you have really to understand your security requirements, and as I said, adopt a risk-based approach. There is a very nice framework that's developed by the Cloud Security Alliance. It has 5 steps. If I have the time, maybe I can discuss it later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bedr. That was really informative, especially speaking about the new encryption technologies for cloud computing, and the cloud security guidance has published some guidance for mobile computing and the usage of cloud and mobile computing. You can refer to the Cloud Security Alliance website for the standards. They are really evolving and they're getting more mature with the days. Just to add on what the panelists said, you know, one of the highest risks for going with any cloud is the risk of the vendor lock-in. So if you subscribe for any cloud service, what is the assurance that you get for moving out from this cloud, and what will be, how your data will be handled, and is there any kind of assurance that your data will be erased, deleted from that provider? So understanding the cloud lock-in risk is one of the top risks as per Cloud Security Alliance. All right, just moving to the questions. The first question I have is for Tamer. Tamer, since you work for one of the leading banks here in the region, so what is your view for cloud services from a banking perspective? I'm not speaking about core banking, keeping that in mind, the jurisdictions and regulation requirements from your local central banks, but speaking about non-core services like disaster recovery as a service without having your core banking data, having your office automation. So what is the banking view from that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So from a banking perspective, we're still, I think you're right, we're not quite ready or mature enough to look at moving data, but there are various fronts that we would look at. For example, vendor services. So there may be vendors that we're dealing with that we might buy appliances from, that we use inside the bank's infrastructure, that you may decide to engage those services from a cloud base. For example, external scanning, PKI, many companies that offer PKI services offer it on a cloud base. So the enrollment and the issuing of the certificates is all done on the cloud, which means from a DR perspective, you don't have to worry about having infrastructure in both data centers. So we have a few cloud-based services for similar types of service products. Another one would be email. There's enough technology around just to encrypt email on storage that many companies, will be looking at utilizing email services from the cloud. There you've got a very large reduction in the cost of ownership and the headache around managing an email system inside. So there are specific services that we would look at.
Thank you very much, Tamer. Abdirashid, I would just like to ask you more about, do you think the cloud security solutions that are available right in the market provides more visibility, having like your services running on a cloud service provider? Do you think that it will be managed in a better way, that your current internal teams cannot manage? Do you think the security visibility will increase if you move to a cloud security provider?
Actually, it depends. For enterprise organizations and government, those who have enough budget and enough technical people, it's better for timing to build their own cloud. But because they're not going to do a lot of savings putting their service on the cloud, because they have a huge base of services. But the small business who are just starting a business, and they can do a lot of saving by going to cloud, because they don't have they have small services, and the capital investment required is very minimum. So I advise for small business, for example, where the data is not critical, to go for cloud, because actually a small business cloud is better, because cloud has certain security requirements where the small business doesn't have it.
Correct. And small businesses will not be able to afford a full-time dedicated security resource in which, in a service provider environment, they can have dedicated backup security staff that are serving multi-tenancy environment. Before reaching to Dr. Bedr and heading the recommendations on cloud security and mobile security. I would like to open the questions for the audience if you gentlemen have any questions for the panelists. So let me have the first question from the first table here. Can we get the mic, please?
What is Zakir from Egyptian CERT? I have a question regarding the forensics analysis or the computing system. I don't know if there is a certain framework or known steps to get the evidence from the cloud in case of incident or, for example, data leakage. So I would like to know, or check your experience regarding these points.
Sure.
An answer.
Thank you very much for the question. Actually, this is very well defined within the SLA agreement with the service provider. So as mentioned earlier during the session, where is the data located exactly and what has been defined. So once you go for an agreement with a cloud service provider, you need to make sure that your SLA agreement allows you to know where your data is located and how can you do the tracking of evidence, the forensics analysis. Especially in the whole cloud business works on a multi-tenancy environment. So one of the challenges that come over is the service provider will not allow you to do the forensics because once you start doing that, you will be exposed to the other client of his. So understanding your capabilities and what limits are you allowed to manage the incidents within the service provider is really defined within the service level agreement, and that will be more appropriate for like an enterprise kind of a level. But if you go for a small SaaS-based application for a small and medium-sized business, you will not be able to get such features. But if you're talking about an enterprise that is going on the cloud, you should have that very well defined within your SLA agreement. If any kind of data leakage or data exposure that happens, you should have the right to audit your client, audit the service provider, carry any kind of forensic analysis. I work right now for a cloud service provider, which is the first cloud service provider in Oman, which is called Oman Data Park, and I come from a banking industry. So to me, cloud was a prohibited word, and even I mentioned that in the policy, having any kind of cloud service is prohibited within the bank. But whether you like it or not, as I said, you'll have your business people using it, but the art is how to manage that. As an enterprise, if you go for a cloud computing service, you need to ensure that the agreement is very well defined and you have the clauses that allow you to audit your service provider. A good service provider will allow you to carry any kind of audit and any kind of assessment to their environment. I hope that addresses your question. Let's have some other questions from the gents in the back. Yes, please.
Mahran Badr from BBK. I have a question for Tamer about the bringing your device. This is something we've been struggling for a year now, to have to give our staff the ability to bring their own devices to use. But my question is, how you manage that? If you're gonna give them the ability to use their own device, they take it home, the kids are playing with the device, they can put stuff on that, and then they bring it to the office. Although we have some control on this, but again, it's very difficult to safeguard your data if you have other parties, other people accessing these machines. How you manage this?
Well, it is a challenge. So I think one of the earlier speakers talked about policy first. So again, we're back to the policy standards and the process, etc. So firstly, you need to have a well-defined policy around mobile devices in your organisation, and that policy will stipulate things around whether the device is encrypted, how many devices a user can connect, should they be password set, etc. So you will have a policy and then the usage and the responsibility on the member of staff. Now you now have to enforce that policy. So for example, something that we do is our gateway that allows these devices enforces the PIN. So if the device doesn't have a PIN on it, you can't connect. It counts the number of devices. There's an additional password. There's deregistration and remote wiping. similar, all quite similar to what BlackBerry had. BlackBerry were doing this years ago, by the way. So we do that now. If someone's son, you know, if I take my iPhone home and it's password protected, and my son, who's, my eldest is, I think, 14, and he knows what my PIN number is, he could open it. So what I've tended to do with my PINs is not to use a PIN, not to basically allow the kids at home to use it. But that's just one aspect of the risk. You know, you're talking about whether you lose it. You know, if you lose your phone and there's no password PIN on it, you've got a problem if someone picks that up. So, you know, the content of the phone itself, if someone plugs it in and tries to read the data off it. So generally, you need to start off with a policy that users are aware of it, and then you'll need to look at some level of technology that can help support the policy. And finally, the people themselves, the weakest link normally, they'll need to go under some sort of user awareness training to be told that, you know, this is, although it's your device, you're using it to connect to the bank, therefore we have a responsibility to protect our data on it. So in essence, the user's giving up a little bit of his rights because he's using his own device. Management like it because it gives 24 hours, they feel their staff are working 24 hours a day because they're constantly on their phones now. So when we monitor our gateway access, we find staff continuously, you know, throughout the night on their iPhones, checking email, responding. So from a productivity perspective, the business likes it. From a security perspective, you know, I don't like the fact that people have got four iPads connected or two iPhones. So you do have to strike a balance, and it is a challenge as well. But I think it all focuses around people, process, and technology, you know, in order to try and get to a level where you're comfortable.
Just to add on what Tamer said, what really evolved is within BYOD, it gets more of a human-based risk management. It's how you manage your personnel and your staff in the organization. What are their norms of using the cloud services and BYOD services rather than a legacy kind of approach in which you manage devices, the risk assessment for devices. It's getting more towards human-based risk management. So I'll leave the floor for one last question. Yes, please.
Let me add one thing. When it comes to mobile security, yes, you need to give your employee ubiquitous access to access from anywhere, any device, anytime. But the IT has to understand the context of the user. If the user is going to access from his desktop at office, he has full access, full privilege. But if it's going to access through internet and mobile, you only limit his access. You give only access to email or whatever other system required, but you don't give him critical systems access. So you need to understand the same user in the context, what device he's using. Is he using office machine, or he's using mobile, or he's coming from the internet. So based on that, you can limit what he can access.
It's me here. I just was single one. I like what you said about the backups and everything, but the question is, which I have, today, the cloud is basically either a software as a service or infrastructure as a service. The question is here, if I open an account with the cloud to have resident in my system, after a year I change my contract, I want to go to someone else. What will happen with the data? You tell me SLAs, you tell me legal, I'm not. Reason is, I don't know how many backups they have taken, where they kept it. Number two, when I'm going to move, is it going to be clean that server or thing? I think that's something everybody missing it, and I think maybe doctor can comment on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very good question. I think, as Maitham said, data lock-in is one of the major issues with cloud computing, and it is still a problem. It has not been solved as of now, but as I said, data lock-in is a result of mostly using proprietary APIs and proprietary platforms. And so to solve this issue, there's a lot of work, as I said, on standardization, on developing open APIs so that will allow you to move freely from one provider to another. But this is one of the risks that you need to assess before deciding to move to the cloud. So before making a decision, you need, as I said, to assess your risks, and you have to define your security requirements. Maybe the data lock-in is not an issue for you. Maybe you're going to use a known software, not a proprietary software that you can find in other cloud providers. So it also depends on each and every organization. But the data lock-in is still a problem.
I think just to add to that, if the architecture or if the design of what you're doing with the cloud means that your data is encrypted while it's stored on the disks, and it's being decrypted as you're using it. If you've designed something in that way, do you really care what's on the disks? Because if the guys are taking the disks and the data's all encrypted, you're not so worried about it. So I think in terms of the design of the solution, you need to, as technology evolves and people become more comfortable, when you start understanding that moving down the line, the data, the cloud provider could be encrypted, okay, and you've got the assurances of how the decryption and where the key management is, you might find that you're in a position where you're not so worried about what data they're actually holding, right, in terms of...
Encryption is actually, I don't have a problem today.
Yeah.
Actually, when you sign an agreement with the cloud service provider, there are 5 things to negotiate, major things. The last one is long-term viability, and that addresses if you want to decide to move your data to another cloud. It's there. Long-term viability.
It doesn't work.
It's a risk that you always need to manage. It's a risk that you always need to manage, whether it's going to be with a cloud service provider or it's going to be internally within your organization. You never know what your data operator is going to do with that data backup tape when he moves it from location A to B. So that's a debate that you always will have, whether it's within an internal organization or with a managed service provider.
It's a trade-off between cost and risk. So
yeah, but I think it's not a vendor. Again, it's not a vendor or provider. There should be some entity on top of that to make sure the vendor or the cloud server provider doing that, because till now we talk about the cloud to someone that can change their mind and can do things. So I think it's still not working.
Just to add on that, you know, I think with the maturity of such industries, we have regulators. So once the industry matures enough, I think we will have service provider regulators as we have for telecommunication. So we might have down that for IT service providers. Just to sum up this session, cloud computing is more of a business model rather than a technology kind of a model. It's a way you reduce your CapEx and have your OpEx running. And what I have seen from interacting with my clients that are running on private cloud, that they save on money and they save on the operation cost, but the security part and the privacy and audit and control part will increase in a cloud kind of environment, which increases more security kind of controls and which makes our demand in the market more as information security professionals. So the requirement for security controls is still there. Once you go for a service provider on a cloud environment, you should understand the first thing, you're not buying an insurance, you're not transferring the risk to the service provider. In the end of the day, it's your data, it's your reputation. If the data gets leaked, the service provider will still run, but your company reputation will be affected. I guess that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay.